I have here with me Sachin. Welcome to my show, Sachin.
Thank you so much for having me on, buddy.
Can you let the listeners and audience know a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Sachin, and I'm a law enforcement officer. Over the last 18 years, I've been serving in CBSA, which is a border agency of Canada. And yeah, over the last few years, I've been struggling with my own mental health, and through that process, I've been trying to find ways to manage it a lot better than I had in the past. So one of the ways that I started doing that was through running. So over the last 2 years, I've been running a lot.
Yeah,
And my first year, when I first started running, I ended up, so in a nutshell, the pandemic kind of started happening. And for me, I was going through a separation and a divorce at the time. And that kind of affected my mental
sorry
health
to
quite.
hear that.
Yeah. Well, those things happen. And it kind of had to happen for me to become the person I am today.
Mm,
So it was super. So since that time, it's been about 3 years. And so one of the main reasons why, my marriage kind of dissolved was I wasn't probably the best husband, right?
mm,
And I had some things that I needed to work on so that I could be a better person. So essentially, what had happened was, divorce starts happening. I'm presented with the type of person I am. I look at myself in the mirror and I'm like, hey, wait a second, I don't like this. So that's what kind of started a journey for me of self-exploration and really a process of reinventing myself. And what I started doing was I started reading a lot. I tried to start
yeah,
understanding of what kind of person I was and how I could become a better person. And I picked up a
personal
book,
development.
100%, 100%. And I picked up this book called Extreme Ownership, written by a retired Navy SEAL called, his name is Jocko Willink. And for me, that was really helpful in starting to understand the victim mentality and trying to remove that victim mentality from my mindset. And so I started this journey, and through that process, I was struggling quite a lot with I have anxiety and depression, and I was really struggling quite substantially with that. But during the pandemic, like sorry, I'm fairly active,
Yeah,
lift
yeah.
weights and jujitsu and things like that, naturally, just generally speaking. And when the pandemic kicked off, that kind of stopped because I wasn't, the rules didn't allow for me going to train like I usually
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
And yeah, and that really affected me. So I started thinking, okay, how do I manage my mental health, considering most of the way I did it was through physical activity, and started running. And so I'm 45 now. I started the last time I ran before this sort of process began was in high school. So I
Oh,
hadn't
okay.
ran
Perfect,
since, I
perfect
mean,
segue.
yeah,
So let's talk about like perfect segue. Let's talk about your like childhood hardships and struggles, like just growing up.
oh man, I'll tell you what. So I'm 45. I was born in London, Ontario. Grew up in Mississauga, Toronto area until I
Represent.
was, yeah, I used to live in Streetsville and in Mississauga, Streetsville area. Lived there until I was about 12. I had so my parents are Indian, Punjabi household, so I'm Punjabi.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and so a fairly
Loud and proud.
and yeah, 100%. But as you can imagine, a Punjabi household, certain type of style of raising children, and so my dad and mom were fairly strict, and they would let my brother and myself know when we weren't doing things correctly in a manner that probably isn't allowed now. So anyway, so that that did probably cause some um, low self-esteem, self-worth, these types of things, based on how they rendered their discipline.
Yeah,
Um, but having said that, growing up in back then in the Toronto area, bullying was, I mean, I think Toronto now is much more multicultural than it was when I was growing up.
for sure.
So, I got bullied quite a bit, and like a lot of people do. And then So then my dad was an engineer, and he ended up moving to Dallas, Texas, with a job.
Mm.
So eventually, I moved down there with him to start high school, and that was a pretty big sort of transition because now I was the only brown kid in my school, whereas before,
Oh,
whereas before it was like, okay, not too bad. Now I'm in a whole new country, whole new state. I'm the only person that looks like me, and I like it was a massive culture shock for me. So like I didn't have any friends or anything for at least 2 years, um, and bullied and like it was pretty tough. At least the way I remember it wasn't pleasant.
yeah, schools there are pretty tough.
Yeah, yeah. So, fortunate for me, I, my I was getting bullied quite a bit, and my dad wanted to kind of help, but he didn't know, how to provide the guidance. So he came to my school with me once, in grade 9, and the guidance counselor kind of just suggested, hey, maybe put him into wrestling. Maybe that'll help, right? So I started wrestling. And I did that for a couple years, and then after a couple years, I started making friends a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit through wrestling. And graduated high school. My dad eventually left engineering and became invested in a restaurant. So he opened up a restaurant
Oh,
in
wow.
Texas, in Dallas, Texas. And so through that process, it was a struggle because my dad didn't know much about the business, and then so he spent most of his time there. My mom spent most of his time there, and I would occasionally work there. And over a period of time, it became successful. So my dad, ended up purchasing another one, tried to make it bigger, and eventually lost everything. And we became homeless for a period of time. So we ended up moving into a hotel. Me, my dad, my mom, my brother. I have an older brother who at that time had gone to university, and we
Yeah.
were living in a hotel at the time. And so let's just, in a nutshell, from high school up until 21 was a hot mess, like
Oh,
all kinds of things happening that didn't allow me for um, having positive sort of environments around me. I was drinking a lot and partying and doing things that probably weren't well, they absolutely weren't good things to do, right?
yeah.
And so, anyways, long story short, eventually came back to Canada, moved to Vancouver eventually. Eventually tried joined the military. I went to RMC in Kingston, Ontario. It's a military school, and I went there for about a year. And I hadn't, addressed my mental health ever until
Oh, okay.
only until 2 years ago or three
Tipping
years ago.
point.
Yeah, I didn't know I had a problem. I just, I kind of managed everything by, oh, I'm gonna go have a drink or whatever, right? Like these types of things.
Numbing your emotions and
Yeah,
internalizing it.
absolutely, absolutely. A lot of it was internalized. A lot of it was compartmentalized. Um, yeah, so I kind of, stuffed it away, kind of thing.
Put it under the
And
rug.
yeah, and you know what happens when you start putting a ton of things under the rug? You start seeing bumps.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, so I joined the military. I ended up leaving because I was drinking a lot, like probably a little bit too much, and so I ended up becoming homeless again in Kingston, Ontario. Because at that point, my parents were. I mean, you can imagine Indian parents. I got into the military college and very lucrative, very good, prestigious sort of opportunity, and I kind of, in their eyes, pissed that away. So I didn't have the strength to let them know. So I was stayed in
Mm.
Kingston, Ontario. I didn't tell anybody. I just kind of lived there, and eventually it got to a point where I was like, you know what, I got to go home. So I called my parents and I ended up going back home and eventually went back to school, studied, and started kind of putting wins together. Because for me, it was like I didn't have consecutive sort of, progress.
Stacking, yeah. Stack
Yeah.
stacking
Yeah.
those progress.
Yeah. I wasn't stacking any wins. There was nothing kind of consecutively happening for me. So I thought I was a loser. I thought
Yeah.
I was a bum. I thought I was stupid. I thought all these things, right? And so, and so what I did was I went back to school and I started training. A couple wins, started stacking them together, and eventually I got on in law enforcement. I had managed my drinking to a point where it was more like, oh, let's go out with some friends, have some drinks, whatever, nothing crazy. But once then I started, got married, had my
Yeah.
daughter, all these things. Everything seems okay. Buy a house, all that kind of stuff, and then everything kind of culminated during the pandemic for me because that's when
Oh,
everything kind of heightened everything for me. And yeah, so anyway, so go through the separation, go through the divorce, start living in a basement suite, and now I'm like, okay, how do I reinvent myself and become the person I want to be? That's what I started thinking. I started
so
thinking, what kind
what
of
was
person?
the when you were thinking, what was like the mindset or like that limiting belief on
Hmm.
yourself that stopped you?
So most of my life,
Yeah.
I thought I was a loser. I
Oh.
just thought that. I just thought that. Like I thought I have such imposter syndrome that it's hard to articulate. Like even now to this day, even the things that I've already accomplished in the last 2 years, now I'm slowly kind of the imposter syndrome slowly kind of decreasing.
Oh, so
But
you're
it's
finally realizing what you're doing and like
yes,
to get to that point.
yes. So I'm stacking win. So not even stacking wins. I'm how shall I say this? I heard this from on a podcast recently. I can't remember who it was, but essentially, I had to outperform my thoughts.
Mm,
So if I thought I was a loser or like self worth or low confidence, I had to outperform that. So now I've kind of outperformed it to a certain degree where I look back, I'm like, okay, I've done some pretty cool things that are positive. Maybe I'm not that much of a loser, and
yeah. You
I'm
think?
doing okay. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's kind of where it goes, right? So yeah, so really at that time, my like when got divorced and when I was really like really isolated and alone, most of my friends over the last 20 years kind of we weren't connecting as much anymore just because
Mm,
whatever the reasons are, they just kind of
yeah.
stopped connecting. And so for me, I was super isolated, super alone. I didn't have any reason to think I was a good guy, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
okay.
That's how I thought, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, so I started running after reading a couple of these books, and I was just at the very beginning stages. For me, I scheduled myself to kind of run 3 times a week, 5 kilometers at a time, and just to manage my mental health and to keep active. But through that process, one thing I know that I'm good at, and one of my skill sets that I have in spades is that I'm disciplined when it comes to doing a task.
Yeah,
So I
because
can
of
stick,
your law
yeah,
enforcement career.
yeah. So I know that I can, if I set a plan physically, I know I can do that over,
Yeah.
if you give me enough time, I can do it. So that's kind of what I started doing. And within like, let's say I started running, within about 3 months, I pushed myself to run 21 kilometers
Wow, amazing.
on my own. So I did that. And look, it wasn't anything impressive. I did it just one day in the evening when it was cold out. And I was like, let me go do this thing. And it was raining and I was feeling terrible actually. I was in a bad mood and I went
Mm.
for a run. And so I'll tell you what, that was the first time I ever ran that far in my entire life. And it was the first time I did something that no one told me to do, and I did it. And I did something that I honestly never thought I could do. And what that did for me was kind of gave me a level of self worth and confidence because I
Yeah.
did this thing, right? So when I did that, I was like, oh man, that feels like mentally feels good. Physically, it didn't, but mentally, it felt good. And I said, okay, let me keep kind of doing this. So over a period of time, within a year span of continuously doing that, I saw some progress, and I thought, hey man, I can maybe leverage this for some positivity. I can maybe do something for other people here.
So how did
And
that start for you, like running? How did you get that idea?
so I read this book
Yeah.
by David Goggins. He's
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, I'll be honest. I read the first 2 chapters. I still haven't even finished the book. Right. I read the first 2 chapters of David Goggins' book "Can't Hurt Me," and it resonated with me based upon some of his childhood experiences, and it resonated. So I was like, and how I what I gleaned from that book was that the underlying theme is chase adversity, do hard things. And I interpreted that as do hard physical things
Yeah.
because I mean, I look at it much differently now, but like at the time, for me, running was hard, and I hadn't done it since high school. So I was like, let me do that. So that's what started the running,
Mm.
and so then within a in about from let's say September of 2020 until November 2021, I continuously ran. And I was training jujitsu whenever I could, and I was lifting weights, and I was working full time, and I'm a dog handler
Oh,
with the type of job I do. So I was doing all these things all at the same time. So I had zero time, and I was trying to do the best I could with the time I
yeah.
had. And so anyway, I scheduled myself to run 100 kilometers because I had been hearing, I listened to various different podcasts and podcasts that, talk about, pushing the envelope and doing things and, just things like that. And I heard a guy named Cameron Haynes on a Joe Rogan podcast, and he's in his 50s. He's an ultra endurance runner. He runs 100
Oh
mile,
wow.
200-mile races, like really far races. And for me, I was like, holy moly, I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't know people had races, like there were races where people run 200 miles. So that got me thinking. I was like, okay. And then I started listening to this Cameron Haynes guy, and he's in his 50s. When he's training for one of these ultra marathons, he runs a marathon a day, which is 42 kilometers every single day in training,
Oh,
right? Right? So I was like, holy, like that's amazing. And I was like, I want to be able to do that. That's what I said. That's what I just said that to myself. And so I was like, okay, let me figure out how to do that. So what I ended up doing is to set up a challenge for myself. In February of 2021, I was like, let me see if I can run 21 kilometers every single day for a week. Let me see if I can do that. Right. Which is ridiculously hard for anybody. And even more so for someone who just started running. Right.
yeah.
So I, I,
Pretty
I
ambitious, huh?
man, to be honest, it's crazy. It wasn't bright. It wasn't bright, but I was ambitious. Absolutely was, and that's kind of how I do most of the things I do. Is just like I shoot for the stars and see what happens. And so I scheduled to run 11 kilometers every single day, and then each week I progressively would increase it by 1 kilometer. After 10 weeks, I got to 21 kilometers every single day for a week. So that again leveled me up internally.
Yeah.
It gave me something that I never like it raised my confidence,
It's like
right?
playing a video. Level
Yeah,
up, level
yeah,
up.
yeah. No, 100%, man. That's exactly what it is. And because through that process, you learn, you get stronger, you understand what you're capable of, all the things that are in a video game, right? Like an RPG, let's say, for example, right? So then I saw that and I did that, and then I was like, okay, cool, man, we can do something here for positive. So what I wanted to do I wanted to run 100 kilometers, but then also raise money for charity at the same time. So I have a connection with obviously law enforcement and also
Yeah.
with the military, and also have family history in the military. So I wanted to raise money for veterans and first responders for Remembrance Day. So November 7th of 2021, I ran 100 kilometers. So I ran from a town called Chilliwack in British Columbia to the Vancouver airport, which was 100 kilometers flat. And I ran that just under 15 hours. It was 14 hours, 58 minutes,
Wow.
which I mean, it was very, very difficult for me, considering anyways, it's hard for anybody. It was a tough task, but I raised $21,000 for the charity that day.
Wow.
And $21,000 went to veterans and first responders with PTSD or mental health issues. So that right there, man, I'll tell you what, that was on November 7th, and then November 8th, I had a significant paradigm shift in perspective. My life changed. I knew I didn't want to do what I was doing anymore in terms of a career and a life sort of direction. I just didn't know how to do what I wanted to do,
Mm.
right? I actually was even more depressed afterwards because now I did this big thing, raised all this money,
It's like
but now
now what?
now
Yeah.
what? What do I do now? Right? Like I don't want to go to like I don't want to be working the same way I was working because for me the way I looked at it was like, okay, yeah, you're in service in law enforcement that serves the community, but what I did in one day did much more than I ever did in 18 years. right? So I was like, I want to do more of that. I want to force multiply service. I want to be able to expand it as far as I can. And if I stay working in an environment that's controlled, I can't do that. So
Mm,
that's kind of what I was thinking. And so, but I was pretty lost at that point. And fortunately for me, I connected with someone through social media, um, who's a veteran, a 60-year-old man who was in the military. Lives about 10 hours from me, and he was a special forces tier one operator when he was in the military.
wow.
So Canada has something called JTF2, and that's the equivalent of the Navy SEALs and Delta Force, Green Berets in the United States. And this guy I met, he was on. So 30 years ago in Canada, they created this team called JTF2, Joint Task Force 2. He was one of the first people selected when the team was created back in the day when it
Wow.
first started.
Amazing.
So yeah, it's like super amazing. So he's at the tip of the spear when it comes to performance and all the kind of cool things, as it relates to military performance. Anyway, so I met with him because I was like, not because of the military stuff. I met with him because I understand what that military stuff means and what kind of individuals are in that role. That's why I wanted to meet him. And I wanted to meet him because I felt pretty isolated and alone because I was doing these kind of really crazy things, quote unquote. And I felt I could maybe relate with someone like that. So I met with him in December of 2021, about a month after I had ran. And I was very, 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 very depressed at that time. Like
Yeah.
I was in a bad spot. And I met with him in person. 30 minutes turned into a 3 hour conversation. And through that conversation, it was very helpful for me. And I talked to him and I said, "Hey man, is it cool if we keep talking?" And he's like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
man, if you think it's gonna help." I was like, "Yeah, absolutely. I think it's gonna help." So
Mentorship.
yeah, exactly. That's what
Yeah.
1000% that was mentorship. But also not only mentorship. Initially, I don't know if I was even thinking that. I just wanted someone to talk to.
Yeah.
I felt so alone. I just wanted someone to talk to. And so I started talking to him. So this is how we talked. He lived in Rossland, BC, which is 10 hours from the Vancouver area, in the mountains, some small little town, right?
Oh, wow.
And yeah, yeah. And I go to, so we Zoom called each other 4 or 5 times a week, 2 to 3 hours a day. So, and I don't say this very lightly.
Yeah.
He essentially saved my life. He performance coached me out of the mental state that I was in. And so when we were talking to each other, I got to know more about him in the sense of, yeah, okay, the military part is like one sliver of what he was doing.
Yeah.
He was essentially an elite performance coach for high level athletes for
Oh,
15 years.
wow.
So he himself was an athlete after he retired the military. In his early 40s, he started doing these things called 24-hour solo mountain bike races. So what that means is you're in the mountains, you ride your bike for 24 hours all around the mountain, and that's a race. It's crazy.
Oh,
I didn't even know that. I didn't even know that was a thing, but it's a big thing. It's apparently people do this, and so he became a world champion in that. And through that process, he eventually started coaching people in that sport, and he eventually trained 6 world champions and hundreds of others amazing athletes. So he and I kind of connected on that performance stuff too. And he kind of guided me in, you know, what he re- honestly, what he helped me with, the number one thing he helped me with was a friend to talk to when I
yeah.
was depressed. And number two, helped me identify my why.
You're right. Yeah.
So
Very important.
my, my purpose, because I didn't have one. I was kind of
Mm.
like, have you seen Forrest Gump?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's an analogy I like to make sometimes. So in Forrest Gump, at the beginning of the movie and then the movie, he's waiting for a bus,
Yeah.
right? And you see a feather kind of floating in the wind, and it kind of
Yeah.
just randomly lands somewhere. Okay, so this is how I see it now. I was that feather before, just by chance floating around, and
Yeah.
then I would land somewhere. But with the purpose, I can dictate where that feather lands now.
Mm.
There's no chance, zero chance now. So this is what I mean by that.
Amazing.
So once I identified what my why was, and my why is this: all I want to do is maximize my skill sets for everyone around me. That's my why. That's my purpose, and that never changes. So if I'm the best version of myself, I can do the best for everyone around me. And by extension, social media, the world, the country, whatever, right? So that's kind of what I identified over a 3 month process.
Oh,
I've
it's
really,
more of
really,
self-love.
yeah, really refined it, right? And as soon as I did that, then I, in 2022, I just set off on my goal.
Mm.
So what I'm doing now, I've worked in law enforcement for 18 years. I'm slowly now starting to transition out of that, and I'm training full time. So all I do now every single day is train.
It's
I
like,
get up in
run,
the
Forrest,
morning.
run. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So like, yeah, that's exactly it. I never even thought of that. I come up with the Forrest Gump analogy. I wasn't even thinking of that. Good for you, man. No, I refined my why. So what I did was in 2022, I started scheduling um, ultra marathons every month, starting in March and ending in November. So an ultra marathon for your listeners and for you is anything more than 50 kilometers or more in one go, right? So I started in March, April, May, all the way to November, would do an ultra marathon. And I was raising awareness for occupational stress injuries, PTSD, and other mental health issues for veterans, military staff, and emergency personnel, and raising money for a charity called the Honor House Society here in the Vancouver area. And it's a small charity that supports these members with any sort of services that they require regarding mental health or even
Yeah.
surgery, while they can just stay at this house free of charge while they're getting their treatment. And they're also building a ranch in Ashcroft, BC, which is about 4 hours from where I'm at now, but it's on 120 acres on a mountain where members can go and get equine therapy and other cutting edge treatment to support their issues that they have. So what I did, I ended up running all this amount and then started really attacking social media, talking about what I'm doing, all these different things, podcasts and YouTube and whatever, and ended up on November 6th, I ran 90 kilometers and we ended up raising about $15,000 for the charity in that year. So really in about a 12 month span, I ended up raising close to $50,000 just through running and doing what we're doing here, just talking to people. And
Wow. Amazing.
yeah,
Amazing.
yeah, and yeah, it changed my life, man.
So, in your own words, what would you say being limitless or having that mindset means to you?
Mm. So limitless. So I feel limitless now,
Okay.
and it took some time to get here. But limitless for me means only being limited by my imagination. So whatever I think of, I know I can do now. That's
Well,
limitless.
that was just what I was talking about last episode.
Because honestly,
Imagination.
but I think that's what it is, man. Because it's what we think. Everything's dictated by our thoughts. All the other stuff is BS, right? And at least that's how I feel now
Yeah, of
through
course.
what I've been doing over the last 2 years. And um, that's what I think limitless is. Now everything else can kind of feed into that. So for me, I'm just a physical guy, and so that's kind of my gift, quote unquote, is that I don't like it's hard for me to do these things, but it's not difficult for me to get motivated to do them. Whereas like some people are like, oh, I'm not motivated to go run. No, forget it. It's not my thing. I'd rather do this thing over here and make money. Cool. Money was never a motivating factor for me. You can give me say, here, there's $1 million there, and you got to, do some accounting. I'll be like, no, I'm not doing it. Just not. But if you say there's $1 million over there, you run across the country, 100%, I'll do it. Let's go. So it's also being able to understand what drives you, what motivates you, and what gets you to move, right? So like, and that's different for everyone. So limitless for me is just being limited by my imagination. Whatever I think, I know I can do.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Amazing. I was
yeah.
so glad to reach out to you and have you on. It was really amazing and great talking with you and having this amazing conversation. Thank you so
No,
much,
man.
Sachin.
No, thank you, Evan. I mean, this has been a pleasure for me, and I thank you so much for having me on. And I'd love to be able to do this again in the future. And then when I'm in Toronto, come
Yeah,
talk to
of
you
course.
and whatever, right? Like
Yeah.
this is my future. This is kind of what I do now. And we're going to be running across Canada in 2025 to break the record for the fastest run.
Ooh, let's go. Thank you
So
so much.
yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you, and keep in
Thank you
touch,
for
man.
listening to
Thanks.
episode 62. not being limited by your thoughts.